Hello there, and welcome to the weekly Outside Views report on the politics in Africa and Arabia. The Danish government has put plans for an asylum seeker center in Rwanda on hold for the time being. Instead, Denmark wants to work for an EU-wide solution. Foreigners and Integration Minister Kare Dybvad told that to the online newspaper Altinget. The negotiations that have already begun about the facility in the East African country will not be continued for the time being. Instead, the new government that emerged from the parliamentary elections in November is campaigning for the establishment of a reception center outside of Europe in cooperation with the EU or a number of EU countries. There's currently movement in several EU countries on this issue, said the immigration minister. Many also called for a stricter EU asylum policy. Before the Danish parliamentary election, the then Social Democratic minority government of Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen had worked intensively to advance the plans for the center in Rwanda. It was considered one of their prestige projects. Their left-wing support parties, on the other hand, were loudly up in arms. However, in June 2021, a majority in the Danish parliament passed a law that would make asylum centers in other countries possible. This allows the authorities to fly asylum seekers to third countries where they have to wait for their application to be processed in Denmark. The EU had distanced itself from the law and emphasized that under European law, asylum procedures could not be outsourced to third countries. Frederiksen is still in power in Copenhagen, but no longer in a minority government, but in a coalition with the liberal Venstre and the center party, the Moderates. Instead, they only wrote that a reception center should be set up outside of Europe in cooperation with the EU or a number of other countries. Denmark has had an extremely restrictive migration policy for years. The goal was to reduce the number of asylum seekers to zero. The withdrawal of residence permits for Syrians whose regions of origins are classified by Copenhagen as safe had recently caused severe criticism. In Somalia, US forces have killed one of the suspected key figures of the Islamic State terrorist militia in Africa, Bilal al-Sudani. The White House announced on Thursday that about 10 other extremists were killed in the operation in the north of the country. Al-Sudani was a key actor and mediator for the global network of IS or ISIS. According to US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, Al-Sudani played a key role in promoting the various ISIS affiliates on the African continent. He was also active in Afghanistan. He had previously belonged to the Islamist terrorist militia Al-Shabaab. The US government did not provide any specific details on the nature of the operation. No US soldiers or civilians were killed or seriously wounded in the operation, it said. Actually, the goal was to capture al-Sudani. However, this was ultimately not possible because of the reaction of the enemy forces. The deployment itself had been extensively rehearsed by the US Armed Forces in advance. The United States has had al-Sudani on its radar since 2012 due to his terrorist activities. The White House said he was still recruiting fighters for the Al-Shabaab terrorist militia, which was also active in Somalia. Last year, the authorities linked him to a South African ISIS supporter with whom he organized the recruitment of fighters and financed training in ISIS terror camps. Initially, nothing was known about al-Sudani's age or nationality. After the so-called Islamic State lost most of its sphere of influence in the Middle East, the terrorist group is increasingly turning to the African continent, according to the ICCT think tank. Accordingly, the IS last year made more than half of its operations in Africa. In the first half of the year, there were more ISIS attacks in Nigeria than in Iraq. In addition to Somalia and Nigeria, armed groups in Congo, Mozambique, and several countries in the Sahel zone are also committed to ISIS. The US is part of the Africa Focus Group of the International Alliance Against ISIS founded in 2021. In addition, the United States is supporting Somalia in the fight against Islamists with drones, among other things. Almost a year ago, the US military killed the then ISIS leader Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurashi in Syria. According to Israel, on Friday night it used warplanes to attack an underground production facility for military missiles belonging to the radical Islamic group Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli military said on Twitter that the attack was in response to 2 missiles fired from Palestinian territory. The 2 missiles were intercepted. In southern Israel, the alarm sirens wailed at night, and the Israeli media reported, citing political circles, that one had to be prepared for a possible escalation of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. According to Palestinian sources, 10 people were killed in confrontations with the Israeli military in the West Bank on Thursday. 9 were killed in a raid in the city of Jenin that morning, according to the Ramallah Ministry of Health. Dozens more were injured, including 4 seriously. It was one of the deadliest military operations in the Palestinian Authority in years. In the afternoon of the day, a 22-year-old man was shot dead north of Jerusalem during confrontations with Israeli soldiers. The bloodshed fuels fears of a further escalation of the already tense security situation in Israel and the Palestinian territories. According to Israeli military, the forces were fired on Thursday morning in Jenin while trying to arrest several members of the militant Palestinian organization Islamic Jihad. 3 armed suspects were hit by bullets in a firefight and others were arrested. The Palestinians are suspected of planning a terrorist attack, it said. A Kenyan court on Wednesday found a Venezuelan diplomat guilty of murdering the Latin American country's acting ambassador a decade ago at her home in an upscale Nairobi neighborhood. Dwight Segaray, who was the embassy's first secretary, was found guilty of the July 2012 murder of Olga Fonseca. That's what Judge Rosalind Correa said in her verdict. The court also convicted 3 Kenyan nationals who had been charged with, together with Segaray, for being involved in a joint plot to carry out the murder. Another suspect who fled after the killing is still at large, and the court said his arrest warrant should remain in place. Segaray could be charged with the murder because he did not enjoy diplomatic immunity after Venezuela lifted it following the crime, as the court ruled. Fonseca was found strangled in her bedroom less than 2 weeks after her posting to Nairobi, which followed the abrupt departure of the previous ambassador after being accused of sexual harassment by his domestic staff. Segaray, who had led the mission prior to Fonseca's arrival, was upset by her presence as he wanted to continue overseeing the embassy, the court said. He intended to be the main beneficiary of the crime, Correa said, adding that there was evidence he tried to interfere with Fonseca's ability to take charge of the embassy before she was killed. Segaray and his co-defendants will be sentenced at a later date, the judge said. The sovereign wealth fund of the Arab Emirate of Qatar has increased its stake in the major Swiss bank Credit Suisse. The Qatar Investment Authority stake has risen to almost 6.9%, according to a corresponding report to the US Securities and Exchange Commission on Friday. On the Credit Suisse website, the Qatari share is still a good 5%, with reference to a report from November 21. Now the Gulf state has moved up to second place among the major shareholders of Credit Suisse, behind the Saudi National Bank, which recently came to almost 10% of the shares. According to the Financial Times, the Saudi Arabian family Olayan has reduced its stake to around 3%. Nevertheless, the 3 major investors from the Middle East together still hold around a fifth of Credit Suisse shares. So their influence is amazing. And this concludes this week's report on African and Arabian politics. And of course, tomorrow there will be the video on German politics. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.